What's the plan?
But
I'll be live streaming it in just a second, so we could just start at 12.
Maybe not, bro. I think if we collect some audience, maybe 12:05, right?
Okay. Okay, I think we're good to go.
All right. Well, I guess I'll start then. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today in this panel discussion organized by the American Center for Justice. The topic of our discussion today is a bit sensitive and it's a difficult topic to be discussing. We'll be talking about the Houthis' abuse of the judiciary in their territories and how they have been utilizing it to further their political goals. So just about 2 months ago, on September 18th, Houthis embarked on, they publicly executed 9 Yemenis for a trial that was, that was not fair and did not meet the minimum requirements for, what a trial should be. And this is, we're seeing a pattern in Houthi practices where they have been misusing the judicial system. And today, we will be discussing the different aspects of this misuse or abuse of the judiciary. And before I go to introduce our panelists, I just want to point out that although today's panel discussion will almost exclusively discuss the human rights abuses and the misuse or abuse of the judiciary under Houthi territories, this is in no way to suggest that Houthis are the only conflict actors that are committing grave human rights violations in Yemen's conflict. The conflict in Yemen is very complex and it's multifaceted. There are local actors, regional actors, and international conflict actors, and each have their own share of grave human rights violations. It's just that today we're just going to be discussing or looking at, Houthis' practices and use of the judiciary to further their political goals. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists for today. We have Casey Coombs, who is a researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. He also works as an independent journalist, reporting extensively on Yemen, where he was based between 2012 and 2015. Prior to Yemen, he reported from the United Nations headquarters in New York, covering UN Security Council work on the Arab political uprisings. We also have Ibrahim Khattabi. Ibrahim Khattabi is a senior legal worker at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where he helps coordinate a large network of pro bono counsel representing Guantanamo detainees and assists with attorney-client meetings at the prison. Mr. Khattabi also serves as a UN-US advisor to the Nobel Peace Laureate Tawakkol Karman of Yemen, and was a lead advisor on the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on the post-2015 development agenda. Our last speaker is Hannah Potter. Hannah Potter is an analyst at the international development firm DT Global, where she focuses on Yemeni media and local conflict dynamics. She holds a master's degree from the University of Chicago, where she wrote her thesis on Houthi rhetoric and propaganda. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to our panelists. Before we go on to the discussion, I just want to remind the audience of, the usual housekeeping rules. I'm assuming that our audiences are watching us on Facebook, if not also on Zoom. So if you have any questions for any of the panelists, please write them down, and we will be redirecting them to the panelists in due time. The audience will have about 30 minutes before the end of the discussion to have their questions answered by our panelists. All right, I guess we will start the discussion with Ibrahim Khattabi. Ibrahim, it would be great if you could just, takes us through how Houthis have been using the judiciary to get rid of dissidents and to further their political gains. You are muted. You are still muted. Sorry.
All right, so how about now? All right, so assalamu alaikum, and thanks Hadil for leading this panel, and thanks to ACJ for organizing this panel. And just the way to start is just what's happening in Yemen. It's a disaster. It's that everyone knows about, and so just to go back to what Yemenis wanted in the first place, as we know, after the Arab Spring, Yemenis want a federal system, want a justice system, want a system that is accessible to every Yemeni, that every Yemeni across the country have an access and have sort of a decentralized system to make sure that everyone have equal access, equal treatment, and the distribution of wealth and power distributed all across the country. And so after that, Saleh and the Houthi militias took over the stage a coup against the Yemen sort of peaceful transition of power. And then as a result, the war was declared. And so Houthis, as everyone knows, it's not even a political party, it's just a party that believes, or a group of, basically a group of families who believe that they have the God-given rights to manage and control the Yemeni lives and their future. And we can't really, it's hard for me to talk about how the Houthis are using the criminal justice system in Yemen, because we can't really, I can't even give them that legitimacy to begin with, because we know the very definition of a terrorist group is using a force and violence to advance their political, any kind of agendas. And that's what happened with the Houthis. So the Houthis are just not being elected, not a group that are recognized by most Yemenis. And it's not, you could say whatever you want to say about them, a political party, an actor in the Yemen war is part of the parties that actually declare war against each other. But at the end of the day, it's what Yemenis want. Yemenis don't want sort of any group, whether it's the Yemeni government or the Houthi militia or the southern group, to basically impose any sort of ruling against the Yemeni will and wishes. And that's what's happening today. So since then, since the Houthi taken over the capital, they just won over or against everyone that doesn't agree with them, whether they civil society, whether they human rights organizations, whether they reporters, and use all kind of violence against almost everyone. And that's not what the Yemenis want. There is also, they have been using the special criminal court, which a court to begin with, it's unconstitutional because the Yemeni constitution doesn't allow for any special court. Saleh used that court back in the day to target the Houthis themselves when they were in war with Saleh, to target any kind of opponents, whether they political or otherwise. And so that court was unconstitutional to begin with. And so we today, the whole entire system are actually in the south and the northern part of the country with the Houthis control. So I wouldn't even call them what Hadir called them, the Houthi territories, because that's not theirs. That belongs to the Yemeni people. And so we can say and talk about how they've been imposing their power and their violence against the Yemeni people. They just took over the country, looted people's even private businesses, planted landmines all across the country. There is no justice system. I mean, they can just kidnap anyone from the streets or take children from their schools and recruit them for the war fronts. And so it's really hard to talk about any kind of justice system that is taken over by a militia, whether it's in the south, whether by the Saudi-led coalition, and they all have committed war crimes against the Yemenis. At this point, we really need to talk, and I think the Yemenis themselves need to think about what they want going forward, and for the international community to recognize that we really cannot have any we can't have any kind of justice system imposed or implemented or led by any party right now in Yemen, whether the legitimate government or the Southern Council or the Houthis. What do we need today to ensure some sort of accountability? We need an international tribunal for Yemen. That's the only way to stop war crimes. That's the only way to hold militias accountable. And that's the only way to ensure peace going forward, because we really cannot talk about, at this point, bringing war criminals, in my opinion, to the table to basically decide the future of Yemen. That's not gonna bring any kind of sustainable peace. That's not gonna solve the long grievances in Yemen, whether in the south or in the north. It's only gonna lead to more disastrous situations. And we have seen that since the international community led by the Gulf countries to basically when they gave Saleh some sort of immunity from all the crimes that he committed against the Yemenis. We cannot repeat the same thing again and assume that at the end of the day, we will have some sort of peace. So again, I mean, the Houthis are just a militia. They have no rights to control any justice system. They're not fair actors. And so we really cannot talk about any justice system under a militia. A militia itself, it's illegal. It's not even a group that is recognized in any legitimate way. And so we really cannot recognize that what we need to do as the Yemeni people, as the international community, is to hold anyone who committed crimes accountable, whether through the public opinion, whether through some sort of organizing a movement, until we achieve that justice. It's very complicated and hard to achieve any kind of justice, but the movements began by one voice, and it starts to lead into more organized movements until one day we achieve some sort of justice. So I'll leave it at there, and then we'll just continue the discussion when we hear from everyone else. Thank you, Hadir.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I guess I do have a follow-up question before we move to Casey and Hannah. So, just by your description, we're talking about a militia that has control over state institutions, one of which is the judiciary, which is one of the most important institutions in any given country, because it is the institution that, is supposed to provide justice for people. So knowing that Houthis is this, in a way, it's a supremacist militia that is in control of the judiciary. How do you see that impacting the different social groups? Is there like any social groups that are more vulnerable to Houthis, abuse of the state institutions? For example, if we're talking about the 9 executions, they were against Tihami people. And how do you see that exacerbating, social, divisions?
Well, the Houthis have been using all kind of forms and institutions to target everyone that doesn't agree with them or with their ideology. And we have seen it with the folks that been murdered by the Houthi militias and Hudaydah. They were not given any due process. And like I said again, we can't expect a due process from a militia that doesn't allow anyone to basically stand in front of the court. We don't have an independent judicial system, not in the South, not under the Yemeni government, not anywhere else. Everything have been suspended. And that's why we see the level of crime that we see today. And not only that, everyone have been kidnapped, and we have seen a lot of political opponents and detentions since the coup in 2014, including political leaders, Mohammed Ghahtan, Al-Subaihi, the former defense minister. A lot of people, and they didn't even allow them to have access to their families. And that's something that we need to think about. And so at this point, it's really difficult to basically even describe what the Houthis are doing, because there is no data, there is no accountability. They're not allowing civil society groups to function, only if they related to them. And so there are a lot of information that we don't know, but also the stuff we know, no one can speak in Sana'a. Even they have been threatening people outside the country. Like if they say anything, they would go and take over their houses. They've blown up a lot of people's houses. They kidnapped even and detain even Yemeni Americans. And so a lot of people have interests within the country and they can't speak because of the level of the violence, and there is no accountability. I mean, even under Saleh regime, people used to go to court, there used to be rallies, there used to be protests, civil society is still functioning, reporters are still covered. But right now, you really cannot say anything, and there is no place to go to seek justice. And so it's been all ad hoc, all for political gain and reasons. Al-Houthis have been targeting only folks when there is, kind of have some sort of hearings when they're high-level sort of cases that would benefit the Houthis. And so it's really everyone but the Houthis in the northern part of the country. And they have all these kind of what they call mishrifin all across the country. They have folks that are related to one family. The Houthis family are taken over, and the related families taken over all parts of power within the systems. And so they brainwashing people. They've been implemented in ideologies in Yemeni. They changing the education system. They changing the textbooks, mosques. Almost removing or just changing the whole entire system and society thinking of the future. And that's something that we need to really make sure that doesn't last for long, because the more the Houthis stay in power in the north, the more we see a different kind of Yemen, the Yemen that Yemenis don't want to see, not the democracy, not the sort of education that we want to see, not the sustainable development, none of that. We will see some sort of authoritarian regime, even worse than the Iranians, not even like the Saudis providing some sort of at least services to their people. So sorry for that long question, but I would leave the floor for others to join and participate, and for the other speakers. Thank you, Hadi.
Absolutely, thank you, Ibrahim. So maybe we will move to Casey. So Ibrahim right now just touched upon the need for having accountability in Yemen, especially for giving the grave abuses of human rights that are committed, not just during the conflict, but also before the conflict. So, as a researcher in Yemen, what do you see the prospects for having accountability in the country? What are the challenges, and what are the prospects for achieving real accountability?
That's a really tough question. And I'll start by just talking a bit about the executions themselves and the backgrounds of these people who were executed, and just to kind of frame my discussion about the accountability. And I mean, the executions were really the outcome of Houthis escaping accountability for 7 years, throughout the duration of the war. It was a brazen act of impunity that demonstrated how little the Houthis care about this concept of accountability, how little they value it. So after just giving a few background details on the execution and those executed, I'll talk a bit about the messages that the Houthis seem to have been trying to send in carrying out these brutal public executions for everyone to see. And then I'll put it in a bit of recent context. So the 9 civilians that were publicly executed in September, they were executed for their alleged involvement in the April 2018 Saudi-led coalition airstrike that killed a former Houthi top leader, Salah al-Samad. And in the months after that airstrike, these 9 civilians were rounded up, arbitrarily arrested by Houthi authorities, and they were taken to secret prisons. This is being forcibly disappeared. Their families had no contact with them. They didn't know that they had even been taken for, many, many months after they were gone. And they were allowed to visit them on just a handful of occasions throughout their 3 years of detention. And during the detention, the 9 individuals were interrogated and tortured until they eventually confessed to these charges that were brought against them, which is always an unreliable way to, get at the truth. And in fact, there was a 10th detainee accused of being involved who died from torture and denial of medical treatment while he was in one of these secret prisons in August 2019, just to give you an idea of the conditions they faced. And also to note, one of the 9 executed in September was a minor. He was under 18 at the time of his arrest and execution, and he was subsequently paralyzed while he was in the Houthi prison, reportedly from torture. And that's why you see in the videos of the executions themselves, there's a Houthi soldier who's, has his arms wrapped around this kid, holding him up, his limp body, because he was paralyzed from the neck down. Another indication of, what they faced, as they were in these secret prisons without due process and being tortured to make false confessions. And all 9 of the ones who were executed, they later stated that their confessions were coerced under torture, but that was never addressed. So just to get to the executions themselves, the Houthi authorities announced the date of the executions just a handful of days before they took place, which effectively took away the defense lawyers and others working on behalf of the accused any time to appeal the decision or intervene on their behalf. And then, the executions was really a carefully orchestrated public spectacle. Hundreds of attendees, including children, were invited to one of Sana's most famous public squares in the capital. And these crowds, filmed these 9 individuals being placed face down on the dirt and shot in the back, semi-automatic rifles until their bodies went limp. It was quite a horrifying thing to watch. And it was purposefully done in the public, which kind of adds a layer of brutality that the Houthi leaders who signed off on this wanted it to be seen. And they wanted it to be seen because they were sending clear messages to, at least two audiences. On the local level, they were quite clearly designed to, strike fear, terror into, the minds of Yemenis, to show, what the Houthi justice system is capable of. And on the international level, the executions showed that the Houthis don't seem to be a bit worried by, pressure by the UN, its member states, diplomats involved, or really any other group and that is, calling on them to respect human rights. And to put it into just more recent kind of context, a week before the executions took place, the Houthis fired several missiles and drones laden with explosives on the port of Mocha, and blew up some buildings that housed humanitarian supplies and damaged infrastructure. So they were already, recently kind of under the spotlight for, grave human rights abuses. It could have very well killed civilians or, aid workers. So scheduling the executions a week after that incident, the most recent incident, was really an exclamation point on how little they really care about the kind of the international and local pressure to stop these abuses. And it's also important to note that, this ruling, this public execution, is not a totally isolated incident. It's one of the first times they've, publicized such an act on this scale. But, in the months before this happened, in late June, the same specialized criminal court, they sentenced an Al-Qaeda leader to death for allegedly assassinating a Houthi leader back in 2014. And they've ordered him to be executed by firing squad and then crucified publicly for 2 days in another public square in Sana'a. And as far as I know, Al-Qaeda and ISIS are really the only other two groups that are willing to, publicly crucify, people and have no qualms about it. So yeah, to get back to your question about, accountability, it's the challenges and pathways to accountability. They're really, in my view, more challenges than potential pathways, at the moment. As Ibrahim said, one of the first things the Houthis did after coming to power back in 2014 was just to promptly eliminate civil society organizations, opponents, journalists. In fact, there are several journalists who are sitting in Houthi prisons since 2015 who have been sentenced by the specialized criminal court to death for, doing their jobs as journalists. And, these CSOs and journalists are the traditional tools of oversight and, some of the traditional tools of oversight and accountability in society. And they've effectively eliminated them in their areas of control. So, pathways for accountability, the UN and the US have sanctioned some Houthi leaders for their human rights abuses and war crimes. To what effect, it's really hard to say, because many of these individuals who have been sanctioned don't travel outside of Yemen. They don't have, international assets that can be seized. So it's hard to say. Maybe down the road, those may have more teeth if there is something like an international tribunal that Ibrahim mentioned. Another more practical kind of tool of accountability is to kind of stop giving the Houthis a pass when they commit crimes like this, because there's really, in many cases, been a really lukewarm reaction to, the Houthi war crimes or rights abuses, including this one by the kind of international community, the UN, states that are involved in working toward a peace deal. It often seems like criticism is, pushed to the side for the sake of trying to negotiate a peace deal. But in doing so, the Houthis are really just escaping any sort of even reprimand for, carrying out, violations like this. So, I mean, there's should be more willingness to kind of call out the Houthis for, crimes like this. Any accountability mechanism that weakens their grip on power, catches their attention, seems to be what would, encourage them to change, their behavior in whatever way. But it's really hard to kind of suggest exactly what that would be, because they've seemed so impervious to criticism and pressure and 7 years of war. In fact, they seem to be becoming even more emboldened in committing crimes with impunity. So it's it's a tough question, how to hold them accountable.
All right, that's great. Thank you, Casey. I do have a follow-up question just based on what you said. So how do you think that the involvement of other regional and international actors in the conflict might possibly complicate the pursuit for accountability in Yemen? Just looking at the last events of the group of eminent experts in Yemen, and the possibility of even referring the case of Yemen to like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, for example. What do you think? What is your take on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the Houthis have managed to really play off different international actors in the humanitarian community. For example, they've kind of put them in a position where they are not really willing to call the Houthis out on obstruction of aid, or they did in 2019, but since then have really quieted down so as not to exacerbate the humanitarian situation. The Houthi group is very good at manipulating, these outside actors and eliciting sympathy from groups by casting themselves as freedom fighters and a marginalized group that is just trying to get its piece of the pie and its power and self-determination, which I mean are patently false in so many ways. But I mean, their media apparatus and their kind of information campaigns have been very effective in speaking to different groups in kind of international community. So yeah, it's tough to see just from being this far out. There are a lot of potential ways that like an international tribunal or another international regional body intervening could be politicized or manipulated. All of these things need to be really taken into account.
All right, thank you, Casey. I guess we can now turn to Hannah. So, Hannah, just by talking to Ibrahim and Casey, it seems that the internationals are, they're kind of limited on what they can do to coerce Houthis or make them stop their abuses. So how would you describe the international community's response to all of the heinous crimes that are coming from from territories controlled by Houthis? Beyond the casual statements and denouncing these crimes, what is your take on it?
Yeah, thank you, Hadil, and thank you for hosting me on this panel. It's great to join all of you. I would say that first and foremost, the international community, whether we're talking about the UN or the EU, the United States, UN envoys, their primary response to any crimes committed in Yemen, whether it's by the Houthis or the STC or coalition government-aligned forces, is simply a statement of condemnation, which is obviously something that is necessary. We wouldn't want them to sit by and not address these crimes at all, but it's also a step that appears to be completely ineffective. So if you look at any of the most prominent human rights abuses that have been committed in Yemen, even just in the past year, so obviously the execution that we've just been discussing, also the arrest and detainment and torture of Intisar al-Hamadi, the migrant center burning down, unclear exactly what happened or even how many people died. Every one of those instances, and obviously many more that we could discuss, the EU, the UN, US envoys, everyone has issued statements of condemnation, and some of them are very strongly worded. The problem is that that's not enough, and that the Houthis simply do not care. And so we'll see that the Houthi response to these statements in the instances where they do respond is either complete dismissal or denial of the accusations, or simply saying that these organizations or entities are interfering in Yemen's domestic policy, which was the case for these executions, right? They say it's none of your business what we're doing here in Yemen. So the real question, I think, which Casey did address, is what are the tools that we have to actually hold them accountable? Because we could quite literally hold 20 of these panels, 20 of these discussions back to back, and we would still not get through the amount of crimes that are being committed, not only by the Houthis, obviously, but by other entities in Yemen. But that doesn't get us anywhere, because just complaining and airing our grievances about these crimes does nothing. And the real crux of the issue, not only with human rights violations, but the conflict as a whole, is that certain parties to the conflict do not respond to pressure, and we simply do not have the tools to pressure them. So when we talk about the Houthis, when we talk about how terrible they are, when we talk about the fact that they're an illegal militia, their judicial system is a joke, obviously they commit extrajudicial killings and a long list of crimes, of war crimes, we come out of those conversations realizing that we can't really influence them. The very limited tools that I would say we have to actually tangibly influence them, other than simply issuing statements of condemnation, would be something like the group of eminent experts and the reports that they've done and the investigations that they've carried out and the crimes that they've documented that could feasibly, at the end of the conflict, bring certain perpetrators to justice. But of course, we see the international community, primarily, obviously, the UN, the Human Rights Council, voting to end their mandate. So even when we do have tools to hold parties accountable, we see that those are weakened or either eliminated entirely. So now the very minimum standard that we would have to hold parties accountable, we have lost. It's really distressing to see that. It's very disturbing, and it kind of leaves, I think, analysts at a loss as to where we can go from here. I would say that other tangible avenues of influencing the Houthis or maybe holding them to account would be possibly working through Oman. I know that this is an approach that others have suggested before. They seem to be the only viable actor because they have stayed out of the conflict, that everyone does have trust in them. And obviously the Houthis are very reliant on them as their base for some of their leaders and spokesmen, that potentially that they could influence the Houthis to behave one way or another. Beyond that, I know that we're all probably sick of hearing things about awareness raising campaigns, because how much can awareness raising really do? But one thing I noticed, especially with the response to these executions, which were horrific, was that a lot of people under Houthi control, especially those sympathetic or apparently supportive of the Houthis, believe that they were completely justified and completely a legitimate judicial process. So they believed that there was evidence against these individuals, that they were collaborating against the state being the Houthis, and that they did in fact, this did lead to the assassination of Saleh Samad. So it would be worthwhile to just very clearly outline in ways that could be shared widely and obviously in Arabic, why these executions were based on sham convictions and sham trials, why these individuals were clearly innocent, which they were. There's evidence that they were not even present. I mean, the young man who was tortured was underage when he was arrested, obviously was not involved. So things like this, awareness needs to be raised across the board so that people living under Houthi-held territory also know that this is a sham, that it is a human rights violation, that it's not righteous at all, because as Casey alluded to, their media apparatus is very powerful and very influential. And so even though we're talking here about how absurd it is that they commit all these crimes and how unacceptable it is, I think there are a lot of people that see them as acting righteously, and that's something that needs to be addressed. I would also just add, I took a couple of notes about Ibrahim's comments, which I really appreciated, but he did say, we can't bring war criminals to the negotiating table. Unfortunately, those are the only parties that we have to work with in Yemen. I mean, if we're talking about representatives of the STC, of the coalition, of the Houthis, and even the legitimate government, the panel of experts, the eminent experts, have documented multiple cases of human rights violations by all parties. Obviously, at least in terms of certain violations, the Houthis outnumber them, but the STC has also committed sexual assault against detainees, torture, arbitrary detention, as have coalition and government affiliated forces. And we apparently do not have the tools to even influence those parties. So the hope of influencing the Houthis or affecting the Houthis seems very, very hopeless at this stage. And I will just end my comments there.
Thank you, Hannah. That was very insightful. I do have a follow-up question. So you mentioned that we have to interact with those various warlords in the peace process, for example, because they are the actors that are in control right now. And we know that there is this peace process where the UN and the international community are invested in. They're really trying to have a breakthrough by this peace process. And we also know that other international bodies, specifically UN bodies like UNDP and other agencies, they have all of these programs to restore the state institutions, specifically rule of law institutions, to try to fix the judiciary in all of those different areas. So how do you see these efforts? How can the international community continue doing these efforts? Continue building state institutions like the judiciary or otherwise without enhancing the capabilities of non-state armed groups like Houthis, for example, who control these institutions and who continue to use them to specifically further their political goals more than anything else.
So I think that this is actually a focus of a lot of UN funded and even US State Department and European funded development projects in Yemen right now, is to enhance the capabilities of the judiciary, at least in government held territory, as well as enhancing other civil society organizations and institutions. And I do think that that's a good approach, because even if there's not a ceasefire, even if the war is ongoing, we do want lawyers who are operating in the country, or medical professionals, or human rights workers to have the tools necessary to do their job as much as possible right now, even though it's obviously very, very challenging. And I do think that one of the keys right now is to have people on the ground who are actually documenting these human rights abuses and these violations, so that in the case when there is a ceasefire, as much as that is possible, or when the war ends, as much as that is possible, people can be held to account. So I do believe in these initiatives. I think that they're positive, and I think that the international community has played some role in trying to improve that situation. But to my point about warlords coming to the peace negotiations table, we can empower civil society as much as we want, but if there are still these armed actors, especially externally funded and supported, who are fighting on the ground, there's only so much that civil society can do, because they will always be spoilers for peace, unfortunately.
Thank you, Hannah. Ibrahim, you wanted to add things about the ICC?
Yeah. I just want to add to what Sana was saying, and I think the civil society part is so important, but the parties involved in the war right now are systematically targeting any sort of voices on the ground, right? They target in human rights groups, they target in any sort of civil society groups, individuals who speak against crimes. And so that's by design, by the way. And I think we need to understand before we even talking about even achieving any kind of justice, is that what's happening in Yemen is not only an internal conflict, but also a proxy war. There are superpowers that are involved in the aiding and abetting against the Yemeni people on all these war crimes. All NGOs and UN reports talk about crimes, the level of crimes amounted to war crimes, right? So, I mean, they want us far as saying that without any sort of a court. And so, look, back in the day, the Yemeni government signed the Rome Statute, right? In 2000, and I think on December 28, 2000, and then the Yemeni parliament, I believe around 2007, voted for it, but then there was a dispute about whether the Yemeni parliament really voted for it. And that's maybe one of the only good things that the Yemeni government and the Yemeni parliament, if they really pro their own people and want to achieve some sort of real justice in Yemen, is that they need to sign that. The Yemeni parliament can vote today to make sure that the Rome Statute is ratified. And if we do that, I think we're in a way to end the war and to hold all parties accountable, because that would automatically allow the ICC, to basically start investigating war crimes. And they already have a lot of information out there and hold these war criminals accountable. And that's, I think, one of the ways to do it, at least to create some sort of real pressure at this point. And we know we were going to have a lot of countries against it, like the Saudi Arabia, like UAE, like the United States itself. And so that's going to be a real challenge. But, I think the real stuff here is that it's complicated. They've been designing this and saying it time and again that the conflict is complicated, but in my opinion, it's not a complicated. It's by design to be that way so Yemenis can give up. So Yemenis don't participate. So Yemenis accept any kind of agreements, whether regional agreements or international agreements, to impose some sort of a new system in Yemenis, whether it's a division, whether it's, dividing Yemen, whether it's like imposing some sort of puppets on Yemenis. And we have seen that in the Yemeni government. We have seen it all across the board. And that's a real problem that Yemenis should not accept. Any real movements toward accountability, that has to start with the Yemeni people. The international community is only a community that will aid at the end of the day, will try to support, will try to do anything in any given direction. But at the end of the day, it's on the hands of the Yemeni people, and they cannot give up. They have to continue to mobilize, push from some sort of accountability. Don't accept the sort of peace negotiation. We have to accept everyone. We have to bring everyone to the table. And we know that's going to fail time and again. And we know it's not going to lead to any sort of sustainable peace, because the Houthis have some sort of real agenda. The coalition, the UAE want to control the seaports, the airports. And we have seen the disaster they created in the south by establishing militias, by occupying the seaports, the airport, built in military bases and Mayun Island, taking over the Sugatra Island. These are bad actors, and the only way to stop them is by the movement within the country, by Yemenis taking it to their own hands and forcing everyone to basically accept what the Yemeni people want. Other than that, we're going to have some sort of an ad hoc agreement, and we know those agreements between Yemeni parties and regional parties don't hold for long. And we've seen it in Lebanon, we've seen it in Libya, we've seen it elsewhere. Not until the Yemeni people really rally together, come together, despite differences, whether it's political, religion, or sex, or anything like that. They need to mobilize, and they need to regain their rights over their own country and their own destiny. That's the only thing that is going to have a sort of real sustainable peace in Yemen. Other than that, we're going to keep talking about the same thing. We're going to have some sort of militia popping up there and another one here. And we're going to only encourage more militias to come to sort of, that's the only way to gain power. That's the only way to gain fame. That's the only way to control some sort of territories. And that's not what the Yemenis in 2011 came out to the streets to protest for. That's not what the vast majority of the 30 Yemeni million people wants. So we need, and especially the youth, need to start mobilizing, demanding. And when there is a real pressure with them, it actually pushes everyone, including regional actors, to step back and for Yemenis to step in. And I think that's the only way I can see it right now. Other than that, we're going to keep going in the same cycle of violence, same regional interference, and it's only going to lead to more disastrous situation.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I do actually have a follow-up question on that. So when you're saying the Yemeni people, are you referring to particular leadership outside of the traditional actors that are in the political arena right now?
Look, the Yemeni
how do you envision that?
Well, the Yemeni leadership have failed Yemenis. Even the independent thinkers, they're not speaking up for a lot of different reasons. Maybe their funding is coming from one country or the other, or maybe they have families in the Gulf countries, or maybe they have interests inside the country and they can't speak up. I think the people, when the people speak in any kind of movement from South Africa to India to anywhere, when people took it up on themselves and led the way to protest and to bring war criminals accountable, we have seen that. Even when you have militias in power, we have seen it in the 1993-94 war for unity. It's like the whole Southern system failed because people want unity at that time, and no one could stand against it. During the 2011 protests, Saleh had the most powerful military in the region, I mean, by man count. And, he have all these trained military and have the networks of tribes and businessmen. But when the people, stood up and protested and demand their rights, he just, started falling apart. And that's with every militia. When people really take it to the streets and have a strong public opinion and mobilization and protest, and that's why they're trying to break any kind of movement in the country. Like they targeting civil society group, they trying to take on, and I'm talking about here the coalition and the Houthis and everyone trying to silence any kind of really independent thinker or people who really wants the best for Yemen. And so, what I'm saying here are the people of Yemen, the regular people of Yemen. Imagine if millions today take it to the streets on Sana'a and Aden and elsewhere. Who can stand against them? And any civil rights movements, whether in the US or elsewhere, when people took it to the streets, they can detain as much as people, they can kill as much as people, but then at the end of the day, the people would prevail. And that's the only thing that Yemenis need to start thinking about, that all these actors, and we have seen it for almost 7 years, whether the Houthi or the Southern Council or the UAE or even the UN, everyone failed Yemenis. They couldn't even lift the blockade. They couldn't even some sort of release detainees. They couldn't even bring anyone accountable. They're talking about peace and political process. But that's, in my opinion, all BS that is not going to lead to anything. It's only going to lead to more wars. Without accountability, we will not have any peace. And so I'm talking about the people need to rise up.
All right, thank you, Ibrahim. Before opening the floor to the audience, I just wanted to give our panelists a final chance to kind of comment on anything that has been said in this discussion, or or just comment on, what are the good starting points to kind of move towards accountability in Yemen, if you have any ideas you wanted to share.
Yeah, just to kind of build on what Ibrahim and Hannah said, about awareness and having, empowering Yemenis to kind of, have more of a say in what's going on in, agency. Although the Houthis have shown time and time again that they're undeterred by public pressure, with respect to basic human rights violations, war crimes. Civil society organizations, activists, journalists, and others must absolutely continue to investigate and document Houthi crimes, even without the group of eminent experts. That's one international body that, had done a good job throughout the war. But I mean, there's so many Yemeni journalists and Yemeni civil society organizations and activists that do amazing work, in this respect. But a lot of the time in a shattered economy, and when you're being displaced and threatened by, armed groups, you really struggle to, have the resources, the capacity to do this. So, I think there's a lot of opportunity to support civil society organizations, investigative journalism, provide either resources or training on how to document, preserve, analyze evidence of war crimes and, human rights violations in a way that can be used, down the road in international tribunals. This kind of investigative work really raises awareness, and, it exposes lies, because, the information war in Yemen is just as, it's raging, just as much as the physical war with bullets and bombs. And, there's never enough, people who can contribute to, looking for facts and exposing them, and, kind of raising awareness about what's really going on.
I would also echo what Casey was just saying in terms of investigative journalism and local organizations. There really are some incredibly talented on the ground Yemeni journalists who have access to information that we just do not, especially living outside of Yemen and not being Yemeni like me. So they should be invested in, and they should be protected, because it's very, very important, the work that they're doing. I would also suggest that we investigate or evaluate instances where the Houthis have been pressured to release certain individuals or have been pressured to be held to account, and really look at what happened there that made them release those individuals or made them hold a legitimate trial or punish people and hold them accountable. I'm certainly not familiar enough with the internal mechanisms of what actually happened, but obviously we see the examples of the Baha'i individuals being held for years on ridiculous charges. And I believe it was 6 of them that were eventually released through negotiations. Even just recently, them arresting, detaining the employees at the US Embassy, obviously many of them are still being held, but some were released. I don't have information as far as what those talks look like or what the pressure that's being exerted on the Houthis looks like. But I would strongly guess that there are mechanisms, there are avenues, either through incentives or through forms of pressure to get the Houthis to act in a certain way. But that would be from people of a higher pay grade than me, for sure, that would have that information.
All right, thank you so much for all of you. I guess we will take now questions from the audience. We have Dr. Al-Faqih is raising his hand. You can unmute. Yeah, go ahead.
أوروبا تستنفر لمواجهة أزمة لاجئين جديدة عبر أراضي بيلاروسيا.
Dr. Al-Faqih, do you hear us? All right, so we will take another question from Yasser Al-Qudaymi.
بدعوى أن مناطقهم باتت آمنة. فما حقيقة أوضاع هؤلاء؟
Hello.
Hi, yes, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much to allowing me to talk with this great people, but really I'm asking you, who you targeting? If you just targeting the American speaker or the American people, that's good. But if you targeting the Yemeni people or the Arabic speakers anywhere, I think you need to have an Arabic translation, because you know, even the Yemeni community in the USA, they can't speak English as the American, and maybe they not understand what you're talking about. That's the first step, but still it's a good effort that you do something in English. And you can really, I am encourage some effort like this, but I need, or I hope that you will hosting some people from the Congress or from the decision makers from the American administration in future, because we need them to understand the Yemeni crisis from the Yemeni people, from the Yemeni community activists there in the US, not just from the Saudi Arabia or from Arab Emirates, that they destroy the Yemeni history, destroy the Yemeni future as well. So thank you very much for all of you, and hope that see you again.
Thank
inshallah.
you. Thank you. And I'm sure that the American Center for Justice will take your notes into consideration in the next time. Yasser, you can go ahead.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I have just 3 questions or 3 points. Number one, you have discussed about the problem or the widening circles of violations, and especially, you know, the situation here in Yemen. I'm living in Yemen. I'm married, and also, you know, the situation itself when journalists and also when political people talks about, for example, the violation or talks about the political things in Yemen, exactly under the rules of Houthis is not allowed. Now we have more than 9 journalists, and also they have sentences them as a criminal and still in Houthis prison more than 7 years. I think you have heard about Mansouri and also his partners. I want to ask, what is the rule of the national organization of this problem, and also is there something practical that the American Center of Justice about to do, or just it's most of people, you know, they are talking about the problem and they can do nothing. I mean, just they are talking, and but there is nothing. It's practical things to talk or to protect these journalists. This is number one. Number two, it's this really nice topic to give us opportunity to talk and to also to participate in this topic, special in when you talk about this issue, and also you know the freedom of journalism here in Yemen is not working well. Even it's not only just in Houthis, but also in Iran, and like under the rule of Ghali. All times, all to make Iraqi there are a lot of journalists like a poet. He talks about tax prison and also about in prison. So now, I mean, what the practical things that
Yasser, you are
as
disconnecting.
organization or as you can do?
Yasser, you are disconnecting. Would it be easier if you could type your questions in the chat? Can you hear me?
We might want to move to the next questions. And
yeah, I think I'll just read the questions that I received in the chats, and then Yasser can type in his questions in the chat as well. I think it is easier this way. So one of the questions was, was the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist organization under the Trump administration a good call to hold the Houthis accountable? And if it was this way, why did it not receive bipartisan support? Any one of you want to take this question?
I'm happy to take that question. So yes, of course, towards at the very end of the Trump administration, the Houthis as a whole were designated as a terrorist organization, and that was quickly reversed under the Biden administration. So part of the reason that this was considered to be a bad decision wasn't that because the Houthis don't commit what are considered to be terrorist acts, but because that designation does make it very difficult for humanitarian organizations and international development agencies to operate in northern Yemen, because of course the Houthis just control so much of the financial networks there. So there was a lot of pushback from those organizations to delist them or de-designate them. And that's what the Biden administration did. They reversed it, which was quite an embarrassing move because it just shows a lack of continuity in American policy. And many analysts felt like it was a mistake to remove them from that designation without issuing demands from the Houthis in return. I don't agree with that position because I do believe that if we had tried to get any concessions or any demands from the Houthis, they simply would have stood firm. They really don't seem to care if they're designated as terrorists. In my opinion, they wear it as a badge of honor. So we would have been stuck in a kind of red line situation where we're making demands in order to remove a designation that we actually don't want to have in place to begin with. And then we would effectively not be able to remove it because then we would have been backing down from the demands. So it was just an irresponsible decision from the Trump administration. It's just another example of how we can't really hold the Houthis to account. And unfortunately, the Biden administration had to reverse that immediately. But in a way, it's good because at least organizations like mine and others can still try to help Yemenis in northern Yemen.
Thank you, Hannah. Ibrahim?
I would like to add to that. I think we know from history that those kind of designations only have negative impact on the people as a whole, but not the targeted individuals and groups because they function differently than the way the international community or institutions work. But then the problem is, I think, when that designation came down, I think all groups that were supporting the Houthis were completely terrified. And I think groups like maybe Hannah's and others could have given permits. But that was a way of leverage and pressure to get the Houthis to come to basically trying to face the international community and know that there is some real pressure. I think the Biden and the liberals in the US really sometimes don't understand the complications and the conflicts of the regions, and that they've taken it from a liberal perspective without really understanding the dynamics on the ground and these groups and how they function. And I think that was wrong to begin with, but it's wrong to end with. Like the way they just pulled it out, I think it was really given also the Houthis more propaganda sort of talking points to be like, even the US couldn't do anything. And the question is not only about the designation, is about what the international community are doing also to pressure the Emiratis and the Saudis, and what they are doing to basically restore the Yemeni government and make sure it's brought back inside the country and make sure that the liberated states and cities are actually functioning and have some sort of order and economic means and some sort of developments. That's not happening. So you really cannot weaken the Houthis or target the Houthis without empowering some sort of the civil society and the democratic movements within the country. And that's not happening. Even in the UN talks, they excluded women. Women are not even part of the government, not even part of anything. Youth and civil society are not part of any sort of talks. There's only sometimes for a photo app, but not necessarily for some sort of a city's talk about the roadmap, and Yemen. And that's the kind of things that we really need to think about and take the picture as a whole, and not only as what's happening against the Houthis, but also what's happening in the south, what's happening in Aden, what's happening with the militias, what's happening in the Yemeni islands, what's happening in the Yemeni airports, why some goods are not coming in, what happening with the corruption with the Yemeni government, what is the UN and the internationally funds are going, how all these stuff needs to be taken into account and have approach as a whole. We cannot talk about just one designation, but also and the whole entire South. And that's what the Houthis are saying today. Look at the puppets in the South. They couldn't even have some sort of any kind of peaceful order within the Aden and elsewhere so people can move toward there and fight us. They literally, that's a questionable thing. Are we under some sort of an international, it's a proxy war at this point. And so that's the problem that we need to face as Yemenis, is that what are we going to do to make sure the Yemeni government is restored and back in the country? What are we doing with the militias that are funded with Saudi Arabia and the UAE? What are we doing with people who committed crimes? What is the international community role here? What are they doing? Are they positively or negatively impacting the situation in Yemen? What could be done better? And I think all these questions are not being answered. Is like, all you hear is like, it's a complicated situation. They need to come to the negotiation table. We need the aid to go in, but we don't even really know where the aid goes to, and whether it's being used for military and war purposes, or really given to the needy and the poor. These are questions that we really have not a lot of information and transparency about.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Casey?
Yeah, and the listing of the Houthis as a terrorist organization at the end of the Trump administration, and then the delisting at the very beginning of the Biden administration, really said more about the domestic struggle in US politics than it did about any informed, policy making knowledge of what's going on in Yemen. It really spoke to how just different issues are driving US policy on Yemen. Not like a sober appraisal of the facts. And I think it's an opportunity to, again, emphasize that informed Yemenis, can reach out to US congressmen, Yemenis in the US, Yemenis who run civil society organizations, investigative journalists, activists, to kind of raise their voices and tell, US policymakers what's really going on, in a way that's not, so much of the conversation has been hijacked by kind of extreme parts of the spectrum that aren't really telling the truth, but providing really well-researched reports and, just letting US politicians, know what different sectors of Yemeni society see.
Thank you, Casey. I think that Ibrahim will have to leave very soon. Do you have anything to add, Ibrahim, or if not?
I would like to hear the last two questions from Dr. Sabri and from Reem too. If there's any.
All right, that's perfect. Then we would go to
if you can take the 4 questions, I think there are 4 questions, and maybe we could then summarize our points. That would be great.
All right. Dr. Mustafa Sabri, would you like to go?
Good evening. What is the position of American journalists about what is happening to journalists in Yemen by the Houthi militia? Thank you.
All right, Reem Jarhoum.
Yes, hello, thank you. And my question is, I'm wondering if there's a list of all the detainees and captives with their nationalities and where they are detained. Does this exist? Are there any efforts to actually do this, maybe even from both sides, just all Yemen detainees, to kind of figure that out?
All right, thank you, Reem. Samra Luqman.
Yes, I wanted to first comment on what was stated about women and their inclusivity in the talks, and I completely agree.
We cannot hear you, Samra.
Okay, let me take. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
So I wanted to comment first on what was stated about the women's involvement and inclusivity in some of the talks. And I think that it's very important considering, especially since, the uprising, started with a woman journalist, Tawakkul, back in 2011. And so I think, maintaining that, that women are important in these talks, a female journalist nonetheless, is very important in ongoing conversations. But my question is more directed at.
Samra, you're muted.
Again? Okay.
Right.
So I'm not sure where I left off, but I was just stating that I think that there is an importance and inclusivity on, including women in the conversations, especially since Tawakkul had been, a female journalist that kind of started this movement in Yemen to begin with. And then I also wanted to ask regarding, our focus is always on, the Houthi, terrorist organization. However, we lose sight of the fact that it is a proxy war and that there are other actors, bad actors in the background from multiple other countries, not to give them, any credence or excuse for some of their actions, but why is it that we're continuously focusing on one group and not on the entire or the whole of the picture? I think that we do need some focus on some of the countries that are involved and that are supplying some of these, militias or the Houthis, and how can we as Americans here in the U.S. Recenter that so that we are looking at the picture as a whole, including women in the conversations, but also including the fact that, we need to make sure that the countries that are involved are also held to account for their actions.
Thank you, Samra. I think we will answer these three questions and then go to Nabil and Muhammad. So does any one of our speakers want to start?
Yeah, I can address Reem's question about the list of detainees. That is a really good question because it would be helpful if we just had one list of which parties are holding which individuals. I think the problem is that a lot of this information is considered very sensitive and confidential depending on who the detainees are. So the UN offices that work on prison exchanges obviously have a very, very detailed list of, I think, literally every detainee that they know to be held by each group for the purposes of exchanges. But then also, if you look at the latest reports by the group of eminent experts and then the latest report by the panel of experts, they have really good details about people that are detained. Not all of them necessarily have names, and I'm sure it's not exhaustive, but there is a list of some of them for each group. And then obviously Amnesty and Human Rights Watch will have many names of people that are held at least under Houthi control. So I would refer to those lists.
And responding to the question about the position of journalists, American journalists on Yemeni journalists in the state of journalism in Houthi-controlled areas. I mean, as a journalist myself, I'm, horrified by what's happened to Yemeni journalists. I mean, I know so many of them personally who were, killed or imprisoned or forced into exile. And continuing to this day, I have, I know Yemeni journalists who were threatened to stop doing the work they're doing by, the various actors, including the Houthis. So, I mean, it's especially difficult to watch because that issue often doesn't get the attention it deserves. Every once in a while, there will be a story about a journalist who is killed or especially if they've worked with international journalists, their profile is a little higher. But in general, that issue is kind of backgrounded, which is really unfortunate. I definitely think it should be something that, you know, people talk about more.
I would like to add, I think, in response to, I think Dr. Mustafa's questions about the reporters and the U.S., I believe, foreign policy in Yemen. I honestly, at this point, I don't know what the U.S. foreign policy in Yemen is. So confusing. We don't really know what they stand on many of the issues and how. We were hoping that since they have a special envoy to Yemen, and it's a year later since Biden took over, and Yemen was like a center in his foreign policy agenda. It's not any kind of movement have been taking place at this point, and I feel like they almost look like, to me, they've taken a back seat right now and not creating any real pressure. And I think I'm kind of confused about that, and there is no clarity where the U.S. stands on many of the issues that the Yemenis do care about, including even the killing of Yemeni American, by the Southern militias. And we haven't seen any real pressure to bring those who committed that crime into account. And that could be something that the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. government sort of pushed to do. I think there's an important question by Samra about why the Houthis and why the focus there. I think there are a lot of good, legitimate reasons as to why, including that the Houthis control about maybe 70 to 80% of the Yemeni lives. Most of the Yemeni population are in areas where al-Houthi control. The Houthis are also a militia, unlike any other political party, including the Southern Party, where it's diverse. It's a kind of group of families that think they have God-given rights, and they don't want to come to the table. They don't want to compromise. They don't want to come in good faith. And so it's hard to hold them accountable and hard to basically have any kind of peace without holding the Houthis accountable or even bringing them to the table for any peaceful solution. And I think that's a problem. I think the biggest problem in Yemen today are the Houthis for a lot of host of reasons. And so we need to stay focused on that. And we need to find a way on how to pressure the Houthis and either bring them to the table in a peaceful way, or Yemenis have to take it up on themselves to basically fight the Houthis until they take them down. And I think these are only the two solutions that Yemenis see at this point.
Thank you, Ibrahim. We'll take questions from Nabil and then Muhammad.
Thank you. Just two questions, actually. First of all, to Hannah, and the other one for Casey. I would like just to ask Hannah, what do you think, why there is no strong international stance from civil NGOs or officials against the Houthis' crimes, similar to the same stance against the Saudi Emirati crimes in Yemen? This is the first question for Hannah. The second one is for Casey. I would like also to thank you, Casey, for your really nice job after even your release from the Houthis. You try now to make awareness for the people around the world about what's happening. But my question to you, what did the US administration do to follow up on your case as a victim and committed against the violation committed against you, actually, as a holder for US citizenship and also as a journalist? And the other question also in the same context, why did we didn't see the same firm stance during your kidnapping and torturing, like the same incidents today, what's happening to the embassy employees in Sana'a? Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil. Muhammad? Muhammad al-Rumayn? All right, maybe we can just answer Nabil's questions.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Do you hear me now, Hadil?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for you all, and also for the American Center for Justice, who prepared such meeting to discuss Yemen crisis. My question for Hannah Porter, I consider her as one of the most interested international activists about Yemen. Yeah, you know that international bodies such as United Nations and Security Council and other international bodies, they are dominated people, and they are exposed measures against who are violating human rights in the world. Here in Yemen, there are many parties that violate human rights in Yemen. But I think Houthi people or Houthi rebels are the most ones who violate human rights in Yemen and kills children and women and civilians generally. Do those international bodies have the power or authority to make Houthi rebels accountable for their war crimes in Yemen generally, as other parties, as you know, they may commit war crimes, or are they out of law or have immunity from being countable? You know that Taiz city is being under Houthi siege for the 7th year. Marib city is being attacked by Houthi for since 2 years. Many people killed, journalists are arrested and kidnapped, civilians, they have no any issue about politics. They are arrested and kidnapped by Houthis in Taiz, Sana'a, the Marib, in cities. So the UN resolution 2216 up to now, just a number come from the UN body, but we cannot see any practical measures against Houthi regarding this resolution. Thank you very much.
Okay, I guess Hannah, both questions are, I guess, the same, more or less. They're talking about why there is no strong international response to Houthi crimes.
Sure, thank you for both of those questions. They are similar. I would say to Nabil's question, why there's not similar maybe pressure on the Houthis or similar responses there are on coalition members. It is quite simple. The fact is, at least from the most powerful or influential countries such as the US and the UK and also the EU, we do have ties with Saudi Arabia, and with the UAE, we do have economic relations, security relations. So with those relationships, which I think overall are positive, comes a form of pressure. So we have mechanisms that we can use, albeit very, very flawed and very limited, but we do have some mechanisms to try to hold them accountable. And they're also considered legitimate governments that fall under the international community. So I hear that criticism a lot. Why don't we pressure the Houthis the way we pressure Saudi Arabia? We simply can't, because we don't have the tools, unfortunately. That's the reality. As we've discussed, they are a militia that's in power, or at the very best, an illegitimate government. So it's very hard to exact pressure on them. So hopefully that answers both of your questions. I wouldn't say that there's absolutely no tools to influence them or to hold them accountable. But like I referred to earlier, I feel like the few tools that we do have are continuously being weakened, such as efforts to document their crimes, to call out their abuses. And so we just need to have a clear entity that's actually documenting these things, calling them out and raising awareness, rather than just simply issuing statements of condemnation.
Right, thank you, Hannah. Casey, you go last.
Okay. Yeah, Nabil, on why the current employees of the U.S. Embassy who are detained by the Houthis, why that issue, doesn't get as much media attention as when I was, abducted 7 years ago. it's kind of relates to what Hannah mentioned about the US having a direct tie with, Saudi Arabia. Me being a US citizen, media outlets were, able to determine that, that's going to be something our audiences are going to be able to relate with, more so than, I guess, if it's a Yemeni employee of the US Embassy, which is, really unfortunate. And it's also speaks to just the general kind of lack of understanding by a lot of international, especially American journalists, of what's going on in Yemen. I just don't think a lot of them have the context to really know like what it means that, 25 Yemeni employees of the US Embassy have been kidnapped by the Houthis. They're not well versed in who the Houthis are, what they're doing, and kind of how this, would make sense to their audience. And it also speaks to the entrenched kind of narratives that have emerged in covering the Yemen civil war early on, because the US has such close ties with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That aspect of the war was, focused on in depth, and, a general narrative kind of emerged as the Saudis and the coalition, their crimes being committed in Yemen, and the Houthi crimes were less well understood, and, they don't have a direct tie with the US, so they didn't focus on that as much. And as the war has gone on, there just doesn't seem to have been a lot of learning taking place in kind of figuring out who the Houthis are and, investigating their part in the war, even though they've continued to, commit just really brutal, crimes like the executions that we're, talking about today. So it's, media narratives, entrenched media narratives have a lot to do with, I think, why that's not being covered. The Yemeni employees, it doesn't fit neatly into the, general narratives that have come to define the Yemen war for the American public. And then Nabil, just going back to your question about what the US government did for me when I was kidnapped by the Houthis. They facilitated getting me to Amman, where I went after Yemen, and then, coming home. And the FBI interviewed me several times to find out, who the specific individuals were who, were interrogating and torturing and, running the prison. And they're continuing to conduct an investigation as far as I know, but it's very secretive. They don't, none of it's public. And they said their ultimate aim was to bring charges against the individuals who were kind of, directly involved in kidnapping Americans and running the prison, these operations. But they've admitted that those likely would never happen because they're just out. The Houthis are so far outside of their grasp,
All right. Thank you, Casey. Because we are running out of time, we're not going to accept any other questions. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists again, Hannah, Casey, and Ibrahim, who had to leave us a few minutes ago. I would also like to thank the American Center for Justice for hosting this panel discussion on this very important topic. Thank you for the audience, for all of your thoughtful questions, and I wish you a good time.
Thank you, everyone.